Okay, good morning. We're in on page on Tafrei Sadik Daled. We are on page 109, I believe. Yeah, 109, which is, as I said, an elaboration and the paralleling pages 1149, 1150, or you could say 1150 at this point in Ayin Beis, volume 2. So where are we? So we have learned that we're talking about the third interpretation of the ayin, the channel in between Yesh Amiti and Yesh Hanivra, the true absolute reality, Atzmus, and Yesh Hanivra, the created reality. And what is the third interpretation? That the ayin is pnimi, immanent, internalized energy. And that too has two levels. And first explanation of that, of the two levels, is the two levels in the Kav. That was the ostensible, like he said, L'cheri yashlemer b'pshitus, that was the words in the Maimer. Seemingly, you could say, explain it simply, the two levels in the Kav. The higher end of the Kav that touches, and is Negeya touches and Dovuk and is attached to Erein Sof is the higher ayin, Shal Yesh Amiti. And the Kav, as it goes, extends downward and relates to existence, is the ayin of Yesh Hanivra. But then he said, Omnam, however, on a more expansive level, it really is referring to two levels in Pnimi in general, similar to interpretation 1 in Makif, in Lifnei Tzimtzum, that there's an etzem and ispashtus. So also Mamala, there's an etzem and ispashtus. The etzem of Mamala is as it relates to its source, and ispashtus of Mamala, and there's no distinction of levels, and there's no gradations. It's not subject to diminishment. It's not even hamshacha v'gili. All it is basically kavonas ha'atzmus in the eir. That's a good way to put it. He doesn't say those words, but it's the kavonas ha'atzmus in the eir, which is the etzem of the eir, sensing the kavana of atzmus in it. Then there's how the eir is in function state. That eir takes the functionalities when it does its function, which is it actually enters and becomes mamala, that will pnimi, that will create and infuse and energize existence. And that's the ayin of the Yesh Hanivra. To explain this, he called this now, he says, these two levels is called Pnimius and Chitzenius Ha'er. Inner and outer dimension of the Eir. Remember, we're not talking about two levels of Eir, one Eir here and one Eir here. One Eir has the Pnimius of the Eir and Chitzenius. However, he says they're be'etzem uhusam, they're very different. Chalukim zem ezeh be'etzem uhusam. They're fundamentally different. And to explain this, he says we'll understand it a priori, the kolshkein, from how we understand pnimius chitzenius in Kalim. And that's what we're learning now. So let's go to Kalim now. And from Kalim, we're going to move back to Eir at some point. So a Kali, as we know, is the functionality and identity of any structure. The Klei HaChochmah, as opposed to Eir HaChochmah. Eir HaChochmah is the energy of Chochmah. You could say it's, again, the divine energy within Chochmah. The Klei HaChochmah is the structure of Chochmah. But a Keli, as he explained, has two sides to it. There's the Pnimius HaKeli and Chitzenius HaKeli. The main part of a Keli, the main function, using his words, I'm just using the exact words. Etzem Muhus HaKeli, the core essence and personality of a Keli is a Klei Kabbalah, the Kabbalah. Its job is to receive, a receptacle that receives and absorbs whatever is put into it. It's la'atzma, not chutz la'atzma. It's not about being extended to somewhere. It's not about continuing. It's only one role. Here's the mashpia, and the keli is receiving from the mashpia. The chitzenius hakeli, the inyan yonikla. Its inyan is not at all to transmit outwards, and chitzenius hakeli lifel ulashpia. The outer dimension of the container is to lifel, which means to affect something, and lashpia, and to transmit. That's chutz la'atzma, meaning to transmit to the next level outside of the keli. So there's the keli as it's receiving from its mashpia, let's say a student from a teacher, And all it is a keli lekabbalah. He's a klei reikon, he's an empty keli, receiving. Then when that student goes and teaches someone else, or in some other way takes the teachings and uses it in some way, then he's using what he received and extending it outwards to lifael or lashbia. And he gives the example of a kos yayin or an other liquid or drink. What's with the kos yayin? I'm reading top of page 109. The pnimi of the keli is the toich shebay. It was the toich, the inside of the keli, which is a cholol amokim pani, an empty hole, a hole in an empty space that doesn't have anything in it. Asher boy mekablas hayayin b'teichen, in which he receives the yayin, the wine that is poured is in the cup. I'm going to read. I'm reading on line 3 now, on top of page 109. That inside is the primary thing of the keli. You don't have that, you don't have a keli. It's not a kos. Al pi halacha, you can't call it a kos or a keli if it's not receiving anything that's supposed to be put into it. If somebody seals it, or there's no empty space, or whatever, or it's damaged, that's not a keli. So a keli means there's a toich to receive something. And it says, "Bilodei hateich lo yaya keli klal." Without that inside, it's not a keli at all. And that the second point that he wants to make is, so number one is without the teich, there's no keli. And the whole teich is only for itself. The inside of a cup has no relationship with anybody else. Even though afterwards you may pour from the cup or you may drink from it. But we're talking about the inside of the keli has only one function, only one role, to receive whatever is inside it. It can remain there forever. You can fill up a cup of wine and that's it, and leave it sitting. A barrel of wine, it could sit for years. My point is not the years, how long it is. My point is the toich has no relationship with anything else except itself. Then he qualifies. And the fact that through the cup you also drink the wine. In other words, it's not just containing the wine, you also drink the wine. That's only the outer dimension of the keli, even physically. It's you don't put your mouth inside the cup. You put your mouth at the edge of the cup, at the outer lip of the cup. So he says, so the drinking of the wine is not, yes, you couldn't drink the wine of the cup that wasn't filled with wine. But the drinking part is only from the outer dimension of the container, not the bulk of it, that inner space, that is mashu atzmus hamuzi, ki mechitzeni is bilvad. It's not the atzmus hamuhus, the core and essence, the core essence or the core personality of the container. Only the chitzenis. V'hainu, shezeu pu'ulas hakeli mashi pu'elas chutz la'atzmei. And what does he define as chitzenis? He doesn't just mean physically, it's the lip of the cup, not the inside of the cup. It means also functionality-wise, that this is about the effect of the keli as it impacts something outside of the keli. In this case, the person who's drinking. The same thing obviously applies if you pour the cup, kashel bracha. It's all that. So what he's analyzing here is explaining how the keli has the primary essence of a keli is its inside receiving, and yet it has an outside element which has a function. In this case, the function to drink, or that's the one he's using here. And that's only chitzeni, that's only to peil chutz outside of the keli. So if you think about the keli, the pnimius keli only knows about one thing. I'm here to receive. I'm here to receive whatever is placed inside me, period. It doesn't think about, and it's not supposed to think about what happens next. The chitzenius keli takes from the pnimius keli and now applies it to something outside of the keli. Drinking, pouring, any function, any hashpah, and so on. So the example of a student works very well, like in Basel Legani, I pointed out in chapter 6 it is, with the essence of what I always talk about, chazara, to read, completely be a keli, to listen to the Rebbe without any processing. You're not thinking about understanding it, you're not thinking about teaching it, you're not thinking about applying it to life. Only one thing, The teacher is speaking, the Rebbe is speaking, your job is to absorb, period. That doesn't mean there are other things that can't come afterwards. Obviously, once you absorbed, you now have it inside you. Now your responsibility is to go teach it, is to go process, is to understand it better, to teach it. But if you think about the stages, stage one is completely dedicated to one thing, la'atzma, to receive within yourself. Not, doesn't mean in a selfish way, it means in a completely focused way. And then there's the hashpah chutz la'atzma. I mean, if you just stop here, it's a very powerful way of explaining true conversation, true communication, relationships, love, parents and children, spouses, teacher and student. The idea that there's a bonding going on between mashpia and makabel without anything chutz la'atzma. It's not like, okay, I'm halfway, I'm listening to you with one ear and I'm busy doing something else with my other ear. It's a complete, that's what a true keli is. The pnimis hakeli, to completely absorb. He doesn't say it here, but when you have the pnimis hakeli intact, you can just rest assured that the chitzenis hakeli will be much more functional. Because if you don't have the pnimi, if you don't receive it completely, how can you really give it over completely? It'll be somewhere, it'll be distorted. He doesn't say all this, but I'm just adding to emphasize the importance of this stage. And that's why it's so important to break it down, because, you know, very often, just applying it to life, when you're dealing with people, let's say, they love each other, friends, spouses, and you see there's a communication breakdown. So the first thing you look for is this: is each one of them a keli to the other? Are they able to absorb and listen to the other? Or they're right away busy giving a rebuttal or thinking a different way, you don't get me, etc. So first thing you look for is the pnimius hakeli intact. And then you go further after that, because that's where often many of the issues are. So right here you have a lesson in life. What does it mean to be a keli? A keli is about receiving, it's not about giving. Does it mean, but he said, nevertheless, he says, the fact that you drink from it is, of course, it's important, but it's chitzenius. It's a second aspect in the keli, not the core essence of it. So a student who's listening to a teacher, but not completely, is busy processing or busy already preparing how to teach it to someone else, is not going to do it effectively because they never received it fully. I'm not hinting to anything. I'm just saying that as a way of understanding the pnimius hakeli here. Okay. Ulechein, the next thing we learned was ulechein hine legabe tuma. When it comes, that's why regarding tuma, I didn't look it up, but we more or less understood it. I think you mentioned clay cheres, clay. What was doing to clay cheres and clay matris. So compared to, but regarding tuma, we find there's a difference between the inside of a keli and the outside of a keli. If they were all one, then if one is tame, everything is tame. In many other things, if it's not a keli, for example, if you're metam, if God forbid you touch a mess, you don't say, "Oh, only my finger is tame." No, it causes the whole body to be tame, because a keli has a unique role. If you're talking about the inside of the keli, that's a very particular function, a particular aspect. The outside of the keli is a different aspect. So there are things, once it's tame, the whole thing is tame. By a keli, you can make the distinction in certain cases between an inner and an outer, because they're fundamentally two different levels. That's the key point here. Okay. The inside of the keli and the outside. Now, I might as well mention that Rebbe brings this, often Chassidus brings this, about Hametzi Eichel Poches Mekeshir on Shabbos. The Teich Keli, that's more than the Shir. So we know there's the Isser of Havarim Reshus L'Reshus. In other words, carrying something from a private domain to a public domain. Let's say you take out a piece of food. So there's a question, how big does the food have to be considered Heitzah, that you actually carried it? So there's, of course, difference between Minatei and Rabbanon, but there is a shir. What happens if you take a little piece of food that's less than the shir, meaning api halacha or potato, you're allowed to carry it. You're not over on Hitzal, let's put it that way. But you're carrying the food in a pot, on a plate that's larger than the shear. So there's a din. Because malacha, you have to have a malacha shetzricha legufa. What's the purpose of your carrying? Is because you want the food. You don't care about the keli. There's different words for it. You don't need the keli. The keli is only there to carry the food. It's like a bag. It's tuffle. Since it's bottle to the food, you don't consider the keli, you consider only the share of the food. So Chassidus brings us about the bittul of the keli to the oir. A real bittul, the oir is the purpose, not the keli. The keli is only there to carry the oir, so to speak. It connects a bit. I just wanted to mention that. Okay. So now he says, so the inside and outside of the container, he says, by Tuma, the difference is between the inner, and the outer dimension of the container. Pnimius is the inner dimension, the inner aspect of the container is its atzmus of the keli, it's the core essence of the keli and mahusa and its personality. In other words, it's essentially, this is what the keli is about. The core function, core role of a keli is kabal, is pnimius hakeli. The chitzenius, he pu'ulas hakeli, is the function of the keli, as it's functioning to achieving something. Not to contain, but to pour or to drink. Shirach chitzenius hakeli, that's only the outer dimension of the keli. And that's why there's in Tuma the distinction between the two. I want to look inside because maybe this even actually clarifies the halacha a bit. Because you could ask, why should there be a difference? If I touch the outside of a container or the inside, why would one be tameh and one not be? But if you understand, because there's two different aspects of the keli, it's almost like two different entities. So you only touch one entity, which is the entity of the function of the, in other words, the tumah may affect the etzem keli, but not its functionality. Technically meaning you can drink from it, but you can't put anything in it, but you can't, but if you, I don't know if that would work, because if it's tummy inside, then you can't drink. Okay, I have to look it up. What can I tell you? The ima yes. Now we continue. And even though sheklolis inyan kavanas hakeli yapu'ul shayode. So fine, you explained to me that the essence of the keli is its its receiving element. Chitzenius is its function and its hashpah, to outside of itself. So he's saying now, but 1 second. What is the kavanah of the keli? The kavanah of the keli is to contain, or the kavanah of the keli is to be mashpia? She says, "Ima yes." Sheklolos inyan kavanas hakeli yapuula shal yoda. That even though that the general kavanah of the keli, the intention of the keli is to achieve something. Yes, it's important that it contain, but it's the pu'ula that comes through it. Kumay being a kos, like going back to the example of the kos, of the cup. The ikra kavanah hi hapu'ula. The main purpose, let's say when you make kiddush on a cup. So it's true, the inside of the cup is necessary because it contains the wine. But what's the pu'ula? What's the purpose of it? Not to just hold wine, is that you should drink the wine. You make kiddush to drink the wine. If you don't drink the wine, you're not mekayim even the kiddush. Not enough to make a bracha and put the cup down. So the main thing is the pu'ula. But kol mokim. So it's not really, he's not completely challenging what he said. He's qualifying to explain that yes, you told me that the keli, the etzem of a keli is its ability to receive. True. And the functionality is only the outer dimension of the keli. But if you think about it conceptually, the purpose of the keli is ultimately for you to drink the wine, not for you to hold wine. It's true when you talk about barrels of wine in a basement where you store wine, there you could say its function is to store the wine for a long period of time, etc. At some point, that's also pu'ula. Because why are you storing wine? Just to store wine? No, because you want to either drink it or sell it. So at some point, you're going to want to pour from the barrel into containers, and either for your own use or for others' use. So he's addressing that part. Since the kavanah of the keli, so in a way, you're calling it not, it's maybe not, yes, it's not technically the inside of the container, but it's definitely the kavanah of the container. Mikol Mokim, he answers now, or explains.
He is challenging what he said. Before he said that the inside is the pneumius, but the whole entire keli is not for itself. It's only, it should be a memutza together. So how could he say that the pneumius is inside? That's what he's asking. That's how
I disagree. The way I just explain it is the way I would explain it, because he's not contradicting the statement that the main part of the keli, which is the inside of the keli, is to contain. He's talking about the kavanah of the keli now. So, nevertheless, okay, let's continue.
The question is, what is the pneumius? So he said the pneumius is the toich. So he's asking, but the pneumius, l'chora, is not the.
He doesn't say. He does. Where do you see that he's asking that the pneumius is the kavanah? He doesn't say that. That's what you're saying. He doesn't say. He just says ikra kavanah. He doesn't say pneumius kavanah. If he wanted to say what you're saying, he should have said that the pneumius. Anyway, let's continue. It's fine. It's fine. Anyway, the point is this: Mikol Mokim, Hinelovad Zeis. Besides the fact, nevertheless, even though it's true that the klolas kavanas hakeli is its pa'ula, is its function, which we defined as chetzenis hakeli, nevertheless, here's what he says: Levad Zeis. This is a common expression you see in Tzadik Dal and Friedrich Rebbe Bechlal, that he breaks things. Levad Zeis means besides one response, in addition. So levad zeis, besides the fact that shalule shahaya batech lekabelas hadover hanitin ba. So besides the fact that without the fact that there was an inside to receive whatever was placed inside the container, it couldn't have its function. In other words, if let's say the keli's purpose is one thing only, for you to drink from it. But if the keli didn't have a toich to hold the wine, you wouldn't be able to drink from it because there'd be no wine to drink from, or the wine would be compromised or it'd spill out. If the teich, let's say, had a hole in it, or it was not a proper keli, it spoiled the wine, etc. So the first thing he's saying, so even though, yes, it's correct, the ikar klolos kavana is the pu'ula, but the pu'ula cannot happen without the teich. That's one thing. Hine kol zeh, in addition to that, kol zeh hu biyachas hakeli al zulasa. All this that we're talking about functionality is, yes, a function when you talk about the keli as it relates to another. In this case, the one who's drinking. Aval ba'keli atzma. But if you talk about the keli itself, yesh mahus mitzias. Shamahus hu atzmus hakeli primiyusa. The mahu is the essential personality of the container. I'll explain this in a minute. Let me read it inside.
Skip the line, I think. I think you skipped the line.
Is atzmus hakeli primiyusa?
Skip the line. I think you skipped the line.
Yeah. You went from El Zulasa to the next line.
Okay. Aval ba'keli atzma hine atech v'kabolo zeu atzma shalo upulosi hi achitzenius. Good. But the container itself, what is the pnimi, the teich kabbalah? That's the atzmus of the keli, and its function is an external element. So these are the 2 points he makes. Number one, though yes, the kavanah of the keli is its pu'ula, its function, in case drinking or whatever other function it has. Yet number one, levad zeis, besides the fact that that's not possible without the pnimius, with the teich receiving the most important thing he's saying here, above all, is that when you're talking about the keli in relation to another, yes, its function is primary. That's the kavanah. But if you're talking about the keli itself, not as it relates to another, so the keli itself, the pnimius is its ability to receive. That's its muhus. And its function is only external. So basically he's saying that even though overall, klolos hakavana, yeah, why did God create kelim? Why is there a cup in general? A cup is there for people to drink from. That's what you say. I need a cup to drink from. You don't say I need a cup to hold liquids. But that's because you're talking about the whole picture, how a keli is relating to its full functionality and to others. But if you talk about the keli itself, as you create the keli, the person who's creating, let's say the manufacturer is not interested in how you're going to use it. Well, I should qualify. It's negeya to know how you're going to use it, because you also need the lip, etc. But the main part of the keli itself, the function, the structure of the keli is containing something, and its function is a chetzenius compared to it. So you have to distinguish between the general kavanah of the keli and as it relates to others, and the kavanah of the keli as it relates to itself. But I think both points are necessary, like I said earlier. Even though, let's go to the student and teacher example. The purpose that a teacher is teaching the student is, like the Rebbe said many times, that you're being taught in order for you to be a teacher. Tefeach almanas latfiach. In other words, why are you being taught? So you should be smart? No. You should be able to now take what you learned and teach others. However, in the process of doing that, that's the kavanah klolis. Or even not about teaching others. Lilmed almanas lasis. There's a whole sugi in halacha that talks about if you have a student that learns but doesn't bring it into action. It's called a talmud she'eino hogin. It's not an appropriate student, because the whole purpose is talmud shemevil de ma'aseh. A student that's just learning for academic growth, it's not appropriate. And yet, that's the kavanah klolis of learning. And yet, in the process of learning, if the student, this is the paradox, if the student, while in the middle of learning, say, okay, let's stop, I have to now go teach it to someone else. Or let's stop, I have to go bring it into Maisa. No, that's not appropriate. When you're sitting in front of your teacher, all you can do is you have to be klei reikon, you have to empty yourself of all kavanas and just absorb. And when you absorb properly, then you can go to step 2 and do what you have to do. So applying these 2 points here is like this. The kavanah klolis, of course, it says kol mi shalem eteirev in a what's the word? Alem eteirev, and it doesn't give tzedakah, is gam ateirev loy kayem es boy. Trying to remember the exact lashon. Alem eteirev.
Teira blig milus chasodim.
Teira blig milus chasodim. So if you don't bring teira, the teira itself is going to be. But that's the clause that we understand. But in the actual process, you can't be saying that. In the middle of the learning, you can't say, okay, let me figure out now how to go help somebody. So there's 2 points here. That in order for the hashpah of the pu'ulas hakeli to be proper, levajes, you need to have first a teich. And the second point, even more important, is that when you're talking in the general picture, how you relate to others, obviously the pu'ula is the general kavanah of the keli. But if you talk about the keli itself as being a keli to an oir, a student to a teacher, or a kos to wine, there the kos itself, not relation to others, there the atzmus muhusa keli is the pnimius, and its functionality is the external. It's I'll just to make it a little more palpable. It's like what it says in Torah, what Chassidus talks about. Where is there higher oiris in Giluyim? In Atzilus or in Asiya? Of course in Atzilus. And Ak is even higher than Atzilus. And Ein Sof Lifnei Hatzimtzum is even higher. And yet Nesava Kodesh Baruch Hu Liyas Leis Baruch Dira B'Tachtenim. So how do you explain that? If the Kavan is Dira B'Tachtenim, the most of the oil should be in Tachtenim. So the answer is the same idea. If you talk about Kavanah Klolis, the Kavanah Klolis is Tachtenim. The Alter Rebbe says everything else is Hoyel Lahem Yerid Ma'ir Panav Yisbarach. Because the Kavanah Sa'atzmus is not in Atzilus. It's in Asiya Gashmis. But if you're talking about the level itself, if you measure the level, the Eir of Atzilus is higher than Asiya. So the Kavanah, as we say in the Talmud, Malchus, the Kavanah is to bring it down to the lowest level in the Kavanah Klolis. But when you talk about the level itself, of course the teacher is higher than the student. But the kavanah is the student. I'm just pointing out the difference when you talk about the kavanah overall, then yes, the pu'ula is the most important. But if you talk about the intensity of the level itself, Talmud is higher than Maisa, even though Talmud Gadol Shemevi L'Dei Maisa. Just to make the distinction here. So bottom line is that there's a Pnimis HaKeli, Chitzenis HaKeli, and even when we talk about the function of the Keli and its importance, that importance is number one, is necessary. First, you have to have the Pnimis, and secondly, there's the difference between the general kavanah of the Keli and the Keli itself in regard to its oir. So there's no, everything is clear and smooth. Now he explains further. He just said about the Mehusa Metzias of the Keli. Okay, so yeah, so he said here Levad Zeis, the Keli Atzmi Netecha Kabbalah Zeh Atzmi Shlo Pulos Chatzens. V'hainu, this means Sheba Keli Yesh Mehusa Metzias. We're back to Mehusa Metzias, something we talked about a number of times earlier in this Maimarim. There's Mehus, Mahu, what is it? And Metzias, its function, its identity, its inner personality, and its Metzias, its shape and form and manifestation. Shamahus, the Mahus, Mahu, the what is it? In other words, its deeper significance. Hu Atzmus HaKeli Upnimiyusa. That's the core Keli and its inside and its inner dimension. Vametzias, and the existence of the Keli, he Pu'ulas HaKeli V'chetzeni Yusa. That's the function of the container and its outer dimension. So even though that may be the kavanah, but it's still in the technical definition of the Keli, there's the Mahus of the Keli and there's the Chitzenis of the Keli. And like he said before, if you compromise the Mahus, the Metzias will not be able to do its function properly. I think that's an important point to emphasize. Okay. This was all an example with a cup of wine. So he says, the example of this above, meaning in Ruchnius, the primis hakeli umashi keli lekabel beteches ha'er shelamayla adayin mibchinas hashpah v'gilei chutz la'atzmusa. The keli, let's say the kelim of Atzilus, or wherever, kelim of Akudim, doesn't matter where the keli is. What is it, lamayla? That it's a keli, a container to receive within it the oir that's still above the state of Ashpah V'Gilui Chutz La'atzmusa. It's higher than transmission and revelation outside of that entity. So let's say the Klei of Chochmah to the Oir of Chochmah. On this level, the premise of it is that Chochmah, the Keli, is all it is receiving the Oir of Chochmah. It's not about transmitting it to Bina or to us or to anywhere else. Step one is that it should be a proper Keli. Its role is to receive properly the energy of Chochmah. To use a physical example, again, I'll use my own another example. The eye, to have a healthy eye, it's not about, we know the purpose of the eye is to see. But in order to see properly, the Keli of the eye has to be proper. So you go to an eye doctor, you're saying, I'm having difficulty seeing. So he looks at the Keli and he sees the Keli is not receiving well, whatever reason. There's something blocking a cataract, or there's an issue of the nerve, or whatever it may be, short-sighted, nearsighted, far-sighted, etc. The Keli is not fully, in a healthy way, receiving Eir Hariyah. Just like an arm, the function of the arm may be to move, but something is not fully receiving. The blood flow is not complete, God forbid. So the first thing you need to make sure that the Keli is receiving its energy properly. If the blood is not running into the veins or the arteries properly of that particular organ or limb, obviously the function is not going to work properly. So in Pnimius HaKeli, the Pnimius of the Keli is the focus is how is it receiving the life energy or the force that's within it. Again, even if its kavanah is to be mashpiyah, but right now the focus is not on that. The focus is the oir. That's before we're talking about how it higher than the state of gili and hashpah to the next levels or out to outside levels. Chutz la'atzmusa. U'kamei shekasav kais yeshuas esa. I will carry a cup of salvation. We say it all the time. We say it in Havdalah, etc. It's a pasuk in Tehillim, right?
Yeah.
So what does it say? So he says, he's going to explain what he means by that. The Isa Bezeir Chelik Aleph, and it says in the first volume of Zayar, Daf Reish Nun Amud Aleph, page 250a, the Ha, this pasuk is talking about high cost, and that is talking about the cost, Isnagidu Birchon Me'inun Yeshuas de La'ela. A cost that contains channels, blessings from a level that's called Yeshua's de La'ela. When you say Kaish Yeshua says, so what does that mean? A kos is a cup. Now the cup could have wine in it. The cup could have other things. He says, the Zohar says, this cup is bringing brachas from a level in Ruchnius, in a higher level called Yeshua's de La'ela. V'hu notilon, it contains it. He receives it, or yeah, like not takes it. V'konis lon legabe, and absorbs. Konis is like knisa. It absorbs, it assimilates, it internalizes. Legabe, meaning within itself. We're not talking about what its mashpa is. We're not talking about what it transmits. We're talking about this cause is a cause that's receiving blessings from a very great place. It receives it and it absorbs it. The Pirush Notilon, the Frierdiker Rebbe explains what means Notilon. V'chulu hu mashakeli mekabelas ha'sa'er b'primi yusa. In other words, the focus on the notil, which means receiving, you say notili takes, is the keli as it's receiving the air in its internal dimension. The pnimiusa of the pastus means pnimiusa of the keli. Unless he means the pnimius of the air. Now, why would he say that here? No. Yeah, well, the keli receives the air in its internal dimension. In other words, the keli is absorbing internally the air. That's what he's saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ukeshem shebekelim gashmim. And as it is with physical containers, that in physical containers, how to yesh masha keli mekabel. He's going deeper into this now. Now, when you look at a physical containers, there's what the keli is makabel, the container receives, v'yesh masha nivle b'tfonis hakeli, and that's what gets absorbed in the walls, in the there's certain substances that actually absorb. A keli can also absorb the taste and even the elements of the thing that's inside the keli. So in other words, there's two things. The keli receives, like for example, let's say a kos. There are material, let's say a kos of silver or gold. So there, I believe they're pretty much immune from absorbing. In other words, once the wine is outside the cup, it's not like you have to wash it out, but it's not like it got absorbed in the actual cup itself. There are substances we know that when you put something in there, it's not just about washing it out. The walls themselves, the object itself absorbs.
When you're cooking, the pot is becoming fleshy because it absorbs.
Right, exactly. And there are things that don't absorb. So basically saying there's two aspects to Kabbalah. One is, I think he's distinguishing between notil and konis. Notil means it receives. Konis means it enters into it. It like penetrates. That's the word I was looking for, penetrates. So he says, Hine dugmasa lamaila, an example of this above, the example of this above is the notilon v'konislan. Oh, right. Receiving and penetrating. Konis means to, like we say notilon, let's say, you have somebody comes and you invite a guest to your house. So you receive the guest. But konis would be, you treat them, you make them part of your family, you allow them to become very much part of whatever is. So konis means to, trying to find the right word, like Knesset Yisrael, Konis, we learned it's like, it's more than challenge, it's drawing in that entity. In this case, it's like saying absorbing or penetrating.
He said, Nivla bedafnois hakeli.
Right. It gets absorbed in the walls of the keli, right? The Zeu etzem muhus hakeli. The Zoyar on Kosh Yeshua Sesha is explained, this is the core essence and essence of a keli. And what is that? Yes, that's the primus. Now the second half, v'hashpa v'agilui zeu chetzenis hakeli, and the hashpa, the transmission, and the revelation that the keli provides, meaning chutzlatz musa, outside of itself, that's the outer dimension of the container. Hare, so what do we conclude? Hare the primis v'chetzenis shebekelim chalukim be'etzem uhusa, like he said at the outset. So we see from this that the inner and outer dimension of the containers are fundamentally different. They're just not, it's not just technically, this is the inside of the wall and this is the outside of the wall. They have very different functions and different roles to play, even though it's chetzenis and primis of the same keli. Let's not forget that. It's not different kelim. It's not two kelim. It's one keli. So that's what he established with kelim. Okay.
What does he mean about noti loin and konis loin? L'mayna f'kimina.
I think he wants to make stronger the case about the keli being a makabel. In other words, it's not just makabel in a superficial way. It's even konis. It absorbs it. It's like a student and a teacher. The student can listen to the teacher. Nothing long would be. He's focused. We're not talking about function, thinking about function or hashpa or gili or processing. He's listening closely. But can you say he absorbed it through and through, became part of his defunus? The walls of the student are completely absorbed? Lav dafka. So I think he wants to strengthen the case of the primis keli's role as being a complete absorber, not just a receiver, receiving and absorbing. That's how I think what he's trying to say here, which is very geschmack, because the Rebbe brings this interesting, I'll give an interesting example. One of the things that Rebbe kochsen a lot, I spoke about it in the Chafaf Abrengen. It's a letter between the Rebbe and his father about why, if Emer Dover b'Shem Emrei, maybe Gula Le'elo, the Mishnah says, when you say something, you repeat it in the name of the person who you heard it from, you bring Gula to the world. And he brings the ayah from Esther that she quoted Mordechai. And that brought Gula Purim. So why do we find the question is asked so often that people don't do that? Even in Gemara. Rishonim, Achreim, you don't always see that's always quoted who said it. Sometimes not. So there's one answer given, like with Rabbi Lozer, that everyone knew whatever he said, he heard from his teacher. So he doesn't have to say it every time. But so many other cases are not like that. So the Rebbe answers, and it's based on that letter, that a beautiful answer. He says, when the teacher is a teacher and the student's a student, of course you have to repeat it in the name of your teacher. But if the student has absorbed it to the point that has become one with his own seichel, so then there is no Shem Emrei. The Shem Emrei has become part of him. And the Gemara in Kedushin says, Talmid Chacham Shemochel al Kvedei Mochel. A scholar who forgives on his honor, it's forgiven, not like a melech. A king cannot forgive on his honor because it doesn't belong to him. It's God's honor. But a Talmid Chacham, kivin sheterase dilehu. That's what the Gemara says. Because when he learns Torah, like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, seichel, maskil, and muskil, he completely becomes one with it. It's not a superficial relationship. If it's superficial, meaning it's not part of him, so then it's outside of him. But once it becomes one with him, then there's no Shem Emrei. So when he says it, it's not two different entities. His teacher has become one with him. I'm just saying maybe that's an example of not just receiving, but also absorbing.
Very beautiful. Rashi in Perek Aleph in Tehillim, B'Toras Hashem cheftzoi u'v'soiros soy yehege. The beginning B'Toras Hashem, then it's becoming B'Toras soy.
Shedikras al Shmei. Yeah, that's the Torah Dilehu. It says that Moshe says Zichru Teres Moshe Avdi. So the Medrash asks, what do you mean? It's Teres Hashem. How do you call it Teres Moshe? So he says, Kivish Moser Nafshi Aleh, so it becomes one with him. Nikras al Shmei. When a person is completely dedicated to something and absorbs it to the point it becomes one with him, so Zichur Teres Moshe is still Teres Hashem, but Teres Hashem has become one with Moshe. That's the word. Yeah. So maybe that's the Konislan addition to nothing. But bottom line, this is all Pnimis HaKeli. And then there's another part to the Keli, which is the Kavanah. He said is the Kavanah. It's functionality, meaning transmitting, revealing, in the case of the cup, drinking, pouring, teaching, bringing it into Maisa, everything we spoke about before. So there's two fundamental different things. Let's see. Okay, we're up to chapter 23, middle of 109. He's going to now qualify. This is still all the Frierdiker Rebbe, addition to Ayin Beis, explaining Pnimius and Chitzenius of Oyer, which is the two levels of the Etzemem and Pespashtus of Oyer Pnimi. That's what all this is coming to explain. But he's gone into a longer discussion of these two levels, and you can understand it's all interface material here. Because if you want to truly have an interface between teacher and student, you have to have the teacher complete, and that's the absorbing part. Then comes step two, the Chitzenius HaKeli, as the student teaches it or brings it into action and applies it. So you need both, every role, every part of the interface has to completely fulfill its role without jumping too quickly. Because if you move away, you don't do the first step properly, the next step won't be proper. Since all of us are parents and grandparents, the same is true with parenting. If you as a child did not have the years of absorbing and learning from your parents how to be a parent, it becomes more difficult to be a parent yourself. Now, I know many will say, one second, my parents weren't exactly functional and I didn't learn much, or I learned a little. That's a sad commentary and part of reality today. But I'm talking about conceptually, to be a proper mashpia, you have to be a proper makabel. The more you're makabel well from the right people, the better you'll be able to be mashpia. And if you try to jump too quickly, like when someone says, I finished my training, and prematurely they say, I finished my receiving, I'm ready to give, not so fast, young man or young woman, because you need to first be a real receiver before you can be a real giver, basically, in a proper sense of the word, which of course creates for a healthy structure. That's why you see young people or people who say, I know it all already. And they're not makeres mekemam. They don't recognize their position and they're standing in front of someone that knows a little more than them. It doesn't usually end up in great results. That doesn't mean people can't be geniuses, but a genius doesn't give you experience. A genius means you learn quickly and you're fast, but properly receiving from someone before, like ish kabbalah ish mipi ish, we say. You have to, the smicha is ish mipi ish. You have to have a teacher before you that you are a complete student to, before you become someone that can become a mashpia. And as I always point out, even the greatest scholar is still called a Talmid Chacham. Even when you're a big mashpia, you're still a student of Chacham. Rabbi Shai Metrani, in his introduction to Gemara Mishnah, it's printed at the end of Masechta Brachas, he brings that. He says, a Talmud to Chachma, Reish is Chachma, Yiras Hashem. You have to always be a Talmud, a Makabel to Chachma or to a Chacham. To say someone's a Chacham, it usually means he's a smart aleck, like a Chacham from Anishtana, a Chacham. He thinks he's a Chacham. A Talmud Chacham is always the great compliment. So if someone calls you a Chacham, they don't call you a Talmud Chacham, it may not be a compliment. Just be aware of that.
Moshe Kibel, even Moshe Kibel.
Correct.
But
Even Moshe, I remember that Fabrengen Yud Aleph Nissen, it was Tafshin Mem, 1 second, what year was it? Tafshin Mem Gimel, Mem Dalet? Meidike Siche. The Rebbe is talking about the fear kashas. Tatich will but the fragen the fear kashas. And he said that our custom is you say tate even if your father's already passed away. And the Rebbe said that because you always remain, no matter, he says, even Aid, Ben Tishim Shana, he's 90 years old, he's still a child of his father's. He always remains, the tata is almo the tata. And I remember the Rebbe, you could hear the tears in his voice. he starts speaking that you say Tate, even though the Rabbeim said it, even though when you say Tate, you're actually drawing down your father below. And we know that Rebbe said the tirche, the trouble a neshama has to go through to come down below when it's above. And nevertheless, you say Tate, 4 or 5 times, the Rebbe repeats it. It's very, very moving. How he says that you say Tate because you're drawing your father down to you. He's coming to you. And the Rabbeim did that. And you can see the Rebbe was talking about it by his father. But he was talking very much in that type of that you're always, no matter how old you are, you're still a child of your father. Very powerful. The idea that you never become a full, you're always a keli, a makabel. But okay, that's just part of this. This is the little farbrengen part at the end of this class.
How do you connect this with the fact that the Rebbe always says, one that knows Aleph Beis to teach Aleph Beis. And once you know that whatever you know, this is what you have to give. On the other side, we're saying that we have to all the time to, you're not ready. You have to always learn more.
When you're sitting at a farbrengen with the Rebbe, the kavanah is not in the middle of the farbrengen to leave the farbrengen and go teach Aleph to someone. You're now sitting in front of your teacher. You have to receive it. Now, after the farbrengen, you could say to yourself, I don't know everything, so maybe I have to still come to another 1,000 farbrengens and another 1,000 classes before I begin to teach. So we say, no, whatever you learned, now go teach. But obviously, it's a constant process of absorbing and recognizing there's more to learn. But there's also an achrayus to teach. It's 2 separate things. So when you're sitting as a keli before your oyer, your role right now is to absorb the oyer. Afterwards, whatever you absorb, now you should pour and spill to others. So it's a constant process. You have to be careful. You don't do that. It's not respectful. If you're standing in front of the Rebbe Yechidus and he's speaking to you, you don't say, oh, I got to go teach Aleph right now. So it's all a matter of timing. Everything has its role. You're in the middle of learning. You should be learning what you're learning. Then afterwards, you could say, even though I don't know everything, I still have to teach. So.
Rabbi Jacobson, is the Rebbe going to discuss the fact that in Panimis Akeli, even though it's mahus to absorb to makabel, and that it also affects the or itself. I mean, there's an interface that goes on. I'm not talking about chitzonis keli giving it over to somebody else. I'm talking about the inside of the keli will affect the or whatever in the keli itself, as you mentioned earlier. Like not only absorb that the wine cask will absorb the wine into the cask of itself, but the cask itself will influence the ore. And the example here would be, for example, what we say that a teacher, when he's giving over to his students, again, I'm not talking about students going out and teaching what he's learning.
I hear you. I know understand what you're saying.
The teacher is going to learn more. What is it?
Okay, let me respond. It's a good question.
Okay.
Let me respond.
Okay.
It's discussed elsewhere, not here, because that's not the subject matter here. In the end of volume 1 in Ayin Beis, he talks about this at length, how the Ur and Keli affect each other. So yes, the short answer is Pnimis HaKeli and Ur have a deep relationship, and they both affect each other, but that's not at all what he wants to discuss here. That's why he's not going to go into it here. No. But I could show you where in Ayin Beis, at the end of volume 1, he does discuss it at length.
So according to that, though,
it's not relevant here. That's why it's not relevant to this. Here, the discussion is about Pnimis Chetzenis HaOyer. So he's giving Keli as an example for that. But
right.
In other places, it's discussed at length what you're asking.
Right. So, but we can see that the mahus of even Panemius is not only to absorb and to receive, but also to mashpia.
No, that's not its mahus. That happens by incidentally. When a student is absorbing a teacher well, the teacher, memela, will give better. But that's not necessarily the function of the keli. That just happens to be a benefit that comes out of the yichud of Eir and keli. So still, the keli always
the
remains
mahus
the
not
makabel
mahus keli.
is sharpening the mind of the teacher.
Or even add knowledge to the teacher.
Yeah, but
that
doesn't make the keli into an Eir. It just means the keli has an impact on the Eir, and there's reasons for that. Because the kavan of the Eir is to go into a keli. Why does the Eir go into the keli in the first place? Because the keli has a mila, but a keli is a keli. A Talmud does not become, it does never says that the Talmud becomes the teacher and the teacher becomes the Talmud. It says, that the student will increase knowledge to the chal. But that's not the function of the keli. That's a result of the keli. Anyway, it doesn't change the fact that the keli has to be, its role is to completely absorb. In the process, everyone will benefit, yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.